President of the Minneapolis Police Union is being pressured to resign after sending a controversial letter to members. The city's police department has a history of racial issues. Its own statistics reveal that its officers are more likely to use excessive force against Black people than white people. Jamie Yukas reports.
Do you think there is an issue of systemic racism within the police department?
I think there's an issue of systemic racism in every police department.
Janae Harteau is the former chief of Minneapolis Police. About 20% of the city's population is Black. But according to department data analyzed by the New York Times, Minneapolis police use force against Black people at 7 times the rate of white people.
Every day, every year, we're the only people here looking for justice is just us Black people.
Before George Floyd's death prompted national outcry, prosecutors drew criticism for declining to file charges against 2 Minneapolis police officers in 2018 for the deadly shooting of 31-year-old Thurman Blevins. Police said they believe Blevins, who fled with a loaded handgun, posed an immediate threat to officer safety.
No justice, no peace.
3 years earlier, Jamar Clark was also shot and killed by Minneapolis police. Police said he was trying to grab a gun and charges were never filed.
There is a problem with policing in the city of Minneapolis.
Janae Harteau stepped down as the city's police chief in 2017 after another deadly police shooting. She's now among the chorus of voices, including several Minnesota labor organizations, calling on police union head Robert Kroll to resign. Earlier this week, he claimed in a letter that the officers charged in George Floyd's killing were fired without due process.
Do you think it's fair to point the finger strictly at Lieutenant Bob Kroll?
No, but I do think it begins with Bob Kroll. He is the loudest voice.
All of our actions, they have an impact.
In 2017, Madaria Arredondo took over for Harteau, becoming Minneapolis's first Black police chief. But a decade earlier, he and 4 other officers filed a discrimination lawsuit against the department, claiming it systemically and continuously discriminated in favor of white persons and subjected Black officers to a hostile work environment. The complaint also accused Kroll of making racist statements and wearing a motorcycle jacket with a white power badge. The city settled the lawsuit for $740,000 without admitting liability.
We reached out to Lieutenant Kroll for comment but have not heard back. We should also mention that Kroll is married to an anchor at our Minneapolis station WCCO TV, and they say she has not reported on the department or union issues for at least 2.5 years. Jamie Yukas, CBS News, Minneapolis.
For more on this now, I want to bring in Jamiles Lartey. He's a staff writer for the Marshall Project, where he reports on police violence. Jamiles, in your reporting, you argue that the Minneapolis Police Department's failure to adopt reforms might have led to George Floyd's death. What reforms did the department fail to adopt, and can you tell us why?
You know what, actually, I almost think it's more important to speak about some of the reforms the department adopted, but didn't take or didn't seem to work.
I'm going to ask you about that, too. I'm going to ask you about that, too, because our colleague Jeff Pegues reported on some of the training that those 4 officers did receive in the lead up to George Floyd's death. So if you want to get right into that, let's talk about that as well. But I also want to make sure that we talk about this other part of the training that Minneapolis didn't adopt.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there was the department invited the Department of Justice in for this voluntary review in 2013, and they made a bunch of recommendations, and a lot of those recommendations were adopted. They automated their system for flagging problem officers. They rewrote their use of force policy with a focus on the sanctity of life. They required officers to intervene when a fellow cop appeared to be becoming abusive. All of those would seem to be measures that would have lessened the possibility of an interaction like what happened to George Floyd, but they didn't. And so I think that's going to beg some really tough questions moving forward for reformers about why they didn't have an impact in this case.
And Jamiles, I'm so glad that you're talking about this, because it's one of those things that you hear people call for reforms and better police training, But it becomes obvious when some of those reforms have already been adopted that unless there's a deeper level of systemic reform in our society, that's all surface level. So from your reporting, do you have ideas about how the department could have done a better job in trying to weed out bad officers, changing its practices, things that go beyond the basics that we saw fail George Floyd?
Well, I mean, what we know is that Derek Chauvin, the officer who's been charged with second-degree murder, had been involved in 3 shootings over the span of his 19-year career. He had 12 citizen complaints against him. We don't know the severity of those complaints or if he ever received. They had this policy of commanding officers could elect to put officers through a non-punitive coaching session on policy due to complaints. But we do know that he was never formally disciplined on any of those complaints. So I think what I mean to say here is that despite the reforms that were enacted, it's still somewhat opaque how the department was defining a bad cop or whether any of these officers involved in this incident were considered to be one, or how that may have played out internally. So I think we're going to get a lot more answers from the Attorney General's criminal investigation. I think that's going to reveal a lot of the internal dynamics of what was happening in the department and how there was no intervention between, a 19-year career and this occurring.
Yes, we'll definitely all be watching for that. Jamiles, I'd also like to talk to you about some of what we've seen across the nation in this past week. We've seen many instances where it looks like police officers are using violence in an attempt to de-escalate protests. We've heard the president call for that. We've seen that officers have shot rubber bullets and tear gas into crowds as well as conduct mass arrests. But your reporting says that when police officers respond to protests with force, that it actually escalates instead of de-escalates the situation. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's right. So there's research on this from as early as the 1967 Kerner Commission, which was this landmark federal effort to investigate urban unrest that was occurring in places like Watts and Detroit. And social scientists found then that abrasive policing action can be really pivotal in turning peaceful demonstrations to violence or destruction. And it recommended that police eliminate those tactics. And studies have continued to find that through the present. So the pattern that we've seen, at least since Ferguson, is that there's a particular inflammatory moment of police violence, and that generates a protest response, which generates a police response. And both of those may either be violent or nonviolent. But fundamentally what occurs is if and when the police do become violent, that proves to demonstrators that they were right to be protesting about police violence. And if the police are attacked, that steals their sense that the people that they're policing present a danger to them and their response is correct. So while the socio-political dynamics are complicated in discussions about policing in America, the question of how escalation works is actually pretty intuitive.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially when you lay it out that way, it becomes clear that it's a path to mutually assured destruction. So I'm wondering, what are the alternatives? Because from the position of people who are making these decisions right now, they don't want to see the handful of bad actors who are leading to inciting violence or leading to looting or other instances of non-peaceful protests. They want to try and stop that. So what are the alternative ways that police can tackle those more negative aspects of the protests that have largely been peaceful?
So I spoke to David Cooper over the weekend, who in many ways was the forefather of this approach to policing protests when he was the chief in Madison, Wisconsin, through the 70s and 80s. And he said, you show up in regular uniforms. People can see your face, although this was, outside the context of a pandemic, obviously. You listen, you relate, you talk to people about their grievance. And in exchange for asking your police officers to make themselves vulnerable in this way, you have more well-equipped cops waiting somewhere close by in case things go bad. But what he said is you never, and I remember I'm quoting him, he said it like 5 times, you never start with the show of force and power, because it ratchets up everyone's expectation for violence and can serve to actually generate it when it wouldn't have occurred in the first place.
Well, Jamiles Larte, I thank you for joining us and giving us some additional insight.